This video series will walk you through one way to plan for inquiry in language arts using the backwards design model. This is step 2 in a 4-step process that outlines how to plan for assessment and instruction based on the outcome modeled in the Planning in Language Arts for Inquiry-Based Learning document. Once you've chosen your outcome, set your learning goals, and developed inquiry questions, you can begin to plan for assessment. It is important to ask, what does success look like? How will I gather evidence of learning? And how will I know if learners have met the learning goal in relation to the outcome? Assessment is a useful tool for teachers. From the evidence of learning we gather from assessments, we can better understand what learners know and are able to do. We can also consider what the evidence tells us in terms of our own instruction. Have our learners met the learning goal, or do we need to go back and teach it again in a new way? Do we need to give learners more time to practice or provide some small group or individual instruction? To gather the evidence we need to inform these decisions, we want our assessments to be reliable and valid. We need to consider how we can ensure that the evidence we gather is reliable. In other words, that our evaluations are consistent based on the evidence we collect from assessments. We want to make sure that our assessments are valid. Valid assessments focus on what learners know and are able to do in relation to the outcome and related learning goals. They are timely and effective in accurately representing the learning. For example, if you're using an anecdotal record to record information from observations and conversations, but you're not using consistent criteria based on the learning goals, the information you record will not be reliable or valid. In another example, consistently recording information such as student was on task may provide reliable information, but it is not valid because it does not reflect where the learner is in relation to the learning goal. A statement like, student used their experiences to brainstorm clear, relevant ideas provides valid, concrete evidence in relation to the learning goal. When we plan for assessment, we want to consider how to gather evidence of learning that will help us accurately determine where learners are in relation to learning goals and where we may need to adjust our instructional practice to best support learners. Planning assessments that are aligned with your learning goals will help you to ensure that your assessments are reliable and valid. When planning for assessment, teachers need to establish a clear vision of what success looks like in relation to the learning goals. We can use learning goals to develop success criteria. Success criteria refer to a concrete learning performance in relation to a learning goal. It is important that success criteria are observable. For example, as learners develop their ideas, you might ask them to discuss, write, or sketch their thinking as a means of gathering evidence of learning in relation to the success criteria. Clear success criteria will help to ensure that your assessments are reliable and valid. Planning assessments that support learning in relation to the inquiry questions you have developed will also provide learners with opportunities to communicate their learning in authentic, meaningful contexts. In our example, learners are supported through a variety of formative and summative assessments as they create a range of communication forms that will help a grade 6 class navigate change as they move to grade 7. Considering success criteria helps us to determine what evidence of learning to gather. It also helps us to determine what types of learning experiences we need to design and how to plan for instruction to support learners in the development of skills and the exploration of concepts being assessed. By planning for assessment before developing learning experiences, we can ensure assessment and instruction work together to support learning goals. You can use conversation, observations, and products in order to gather information about where learners are in relation to the goals, and use the information to revise or modify plans for further instruction and provide feedback to learners. Let's go back to our example. As we plan for assessment, we can consider what evidence of learning can be gathered when learners investigate how ideas are developed. We can also plan for how we might gather evidence of learning. In this case, we have planned a formative assessment where evidence can be gathered through an anecdotal record using observations and conversations. We chose an anecdotal record because it allows us to record our observations using concrete details in relation to the learning goals. When choosing what information to record, it's important to think about reliability and validity. Recording information based on consistent criteria helps to ensure your assessments are reliable. Developing criteria based on learning goals helps to ensure that your assessments are valid. One powerful way teachers can plan to support learning is through feedback loops. Engaging learners in a series of formative assessments allows a teacher to provide feedback in order to move learners forward with the learning and to assess their own instructional practice. Formative assessments are ongoing assessments for learning based on intentional observations of learners during specific learning experiences. The Planning in Language Arts for Inquiry-Based Learning document provides several examples of formative assessments as well as questions you might consider based on the evidence of learning you gather. Feedback from formative assessments provides learners with concrete information during their learning and in relation to learning goals. Formative assessments for their learning scaffold towards summative assessments of their learning. In our example, formative assessments are planned that will support learners in building their skills in relation to the concepts before engaging with a summative assessment. Through formative assessments, teachers can plan to provide feedback as learners are investigating how ideas are developed and applying the research process as they begin to create communication forms in relation to the central inquiry question. Because you are developing formative assessments to support the learning communicated in summative assessments, it's important to consider what evidence of learning you are gathering and how to communicate that information. As you begin to scaffold formative assessments in relation to summative assessments, you can plan for what evidence might be gathered to guide next step instruction, how you will provide feedback to learners to support them in developing their skills and language processes, and what information to communicate through a learning management system such as Power Teacher Pro. Summative assessments are assessments of learning. They provide information about where learners are in relation to learning goals. You can plan for summative assessments to allow learners to communicate their learning after they have had opportunities to develop their skills in relation to concepts. Summative assessments are used to calculate final grades during the evaluation period. They also provide important opportunities to give feedback to learners that they can apply when further developing their skills when you return to this outcome at another point in the year. As learners develop their skills, we want to consider how we can provide feedback in relation to the success criteria and give concrete ways to move learning forward. Learners should be given voice and choice in terms of assessment. When planning for assessment, you can consider how best to support this in relation to learning goals and success criteria. By giving learners voice, we can offer opportunities for learners to give feedback and help shape assessment. For example, you might plan to ask your learners to co-create a rating scale for a rubric. Learners benefit from having choice in how they will communicate their learning. In a structured inquiry, we can plan to offer learners a range of choices in relation to formative and summative assessments. Offering limited choices that are supported by explicit instruction supports learners in effectively communicating their learning. It also provides you with opportunities to consider how you might plan to support learners in using a range of language processes to communicate their learning over the course of the inquiry. As learners become more familiar with different communication forms, you can gradually provide more choices and give learners opportunities to suggest alternatives. Once we have identified what evidence of learning will be used for assessment, we can begin to design the instructional plan. For more information on instructional plans, please watch Step 3, Map Out the Instructional Plan.